But yeah, it'll be definitely on this channel. Sorry. I'm in. Hoffman, welcome to Preserving Free Speech, a Practical Privacy Approach. We're going to have some technical announcements before we start so we can be as interactive as possible. Lauren.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I just want to let you know that all you have to do to participate, to submit questions, you can do it using your name or anonymously. Go to slido.com, #RightsCon, and you'll be able to submit questions, and the moderators will be taking them. Thank you so much. Choose the cottage.
Oh, I think it would be fun if you ask questions randomly to people in other rooms and they wonder, why are we talking about privacy and free speech? On a positive note, this topic is almost contiguous with the entire conference, so we do have broad leeway in discussing a lot of interesting issues. I'm Jill Bronfman. I'm the director of the Privacy and Technology Project, which fits under the Institute for Innovation Law, which is at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. So I've been doing this job for about 18 months, teaching survey class and data privacy law. This semester I'm teaching privacy compliance, which attempts to be a bit more practical. Nothing like getting law students some practical training so they can actually go out there and be useful. That's kind of the mecca of law school training these days. And before this job that I've been at for just about the past 18 months, I was assistant general counsel at Verizon and was in charge of network security for the West Coast in addition to general deal making. So I come to privacy from kind of a network security sort of background. And it's good to know that. A lot of people come to privacy from different backgrounds. Some people have done HR or employment law. Some people come from the IT field and have more of a security bent. A variety of different backgrounds when we talk about privacy. I did have a student ask me, so, Professor Bronfman, when you were in law school, what kind of privacy classes did you take? And what kind of privacy law did you want to practice? And I said, there was no such thing. It wasn't even on the radar when I was in law school in the dark ages. So it really has kind of evolved as a hybrid of a lot of different areas of law and different practices and become a really important function of law and policy and human relations and the practical and the policy aspects together. So we're here today with a fantastic panel of experts and discussants in the area of privacy law and policy. And we'll talk a little bit today about how to protect privacy while also safeguarding free speech. Very delicate balance. And you may have, like I mentioned, have heard this topic brought up in other sessions yesterday. Joseph Lorenzo Hall is the Chief Technologist and Director of the Internet Architecture Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit advocacy organization. And we also have Jess Hemmerly is the Manager of Public Policy. Oh, let me do this in order. Michelle Paulson is the Legal Director at Wikimedia Foundation. Amy Keating is the Legal Director of Litigation at Twitter. And Jess Hemmerly is the Manager of Public Policy and Government Relations at Google. So we have a fantastic panel of interesting people with different backgrounds. And the first thing I'm going to ask the panelists to do is to go through really quickly, without reiterating their entire bios and levels of interest, talk a little bit about how their job function creates, implements, and addresses that balance between free speech and privacy. Jeff?
Hi, everyone. Ooh, wow. Okay. Hot mic. At CDT, I'm the chief technologist there, and I also direct what's called our Internet Architecture Project, which is an effort to embed human rights values into the direct architecture of the internet. So I work in things like the Internet Engineering Task Force, the W3C. These are technical standard settings organizations. And the reason that's important is if you can embed sort of freedom of expression, for example, or privacy or security, some of these fundamental rights into these technologies, then people don't have to think about them. You don't have to bootstrap stuff on later. It's just there, it works. You can think of this to be to talk about a specific company for a sec, if you use iMessage on an iOS device, you know that thing is encrypted if you see a blue message, right? It's all you got to know. If it's green, which is unfortunate, it's totally not encrypted and unauthenticated. That's a regular SMS. So often my role is of a translator. I try my best to make sure that the legal community understands the technical details of the stuff they're doing, and then similarly, the technical community needs to understand why certain policies and laws exist and are the way they are.
Great. I like the green versus blue. Which was better, green or blue?
Blue, unfortunately, green should really be red, but I think you don't want to scare people. But
Yeah, well, you know, nothing's perfect. It's not all green or red, right? There's levels of gradation, and I appreciate that emphasis on privacy by design and security by design. I didn't hear anybody talk about it yesterday, but I bet you there are definitely tracks talking about it yesterday. I couldn't do the Hermione Granger thing and be in multiple places studying multiple things at the same time yesterday, although I'm still working on that technological development. Michelle?
Hi, I'm Michelle Paulson. I'm with the Wikimedia Foundation. I'm a legal director there. I've worked on a variety of issues, but a lot of what I'm focusing on recently is freedom of speech litigation, as well as our overall privacy strategy. I also work on our transparency report, among other things, including like copyright and trademark issues. But one of the things that I really take pride in my job is that I have the opportunity to defend our entire community's work of just Wikipedia is the most well-known one, but there's a whole slew of online collaborative projects that are meant to be educational and put forth free knowledge of around the world and be a source of education for everyone. And I get to defend the content when it's being threatened by defamation suits, by copyright suits, frequently abusive suits against both us and individual members of our community.
My name is Amy Keating. I'm our Senior Legal Director for Litigation at Twitter. I've been there about 3.5 years now. My organization includes our global litigation management practice, our legal law enforcement work, and our e-discovery work. It's a pretty awesome set of issues we get to cover at Twitter as in this particular team. I think we've really, over the last 3.5 years, I think built out a great in-house team that is really committed to defending and protecting our users' voices. And I think there's a lot that we continue to learn, including from being at conferences like this and building out our practice internally. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk to all of you.
Good morning. My name is Jess Hemmerly. I am a public policy manager at Google, located here in San Francisco. And I oversee our transparency report. And if you also happen to be a member of the Take Action email community list, which was sort of founded in the SOPA PIPA battle, you're now getting emails from me every once in a while. So that was an interesting change last year. But I'm sort of oversee our global advocacy efforts. And I worked on privacy pretty much exclusively for 2 years at Google until I transitioned over to sort of more of the advocacy kind of work. But I also work on the right to be forgotten globally as well. So kind of an interesting mix of stuff.
Yeah, we could do a whole session on that, right?
No, we don't need to do that.
Things are happening. Thanks, Jess. One of the things I like to share with the group before we go into any of the topics is that no one here is, this is the general disclaimer, no one here is speaking on behalf of their organization. This is an academic and intellectual conversation. We're talking about the benefits and detriments of different technologies and methodologies for ensuring and encouraging privacy and free speech online and balancing the two, but no one is speaking on behalf of their organization specifically. Great. I love when you talk about the person behind the mailing list. That's great. Don't hold it against her. So one of the things we were talking about when we got together before this event with the panelists is how to make free speech happen online. Like, what are the methodologies? What can you do? And how does the transparency report address those issues, further that function? Michelle, what do you think?
So I think privacy is one of the biggest building blocks that enables speech. While it's relatively easy to have some discussion that you're relatively confident about and there's no fear of reprisal, that's a pretty small range of topics that you can be discussing. And you want to have the full range of conversation, and with that, privacy enables that. And I think with transparency, when I talk about transparency, I'm talking about organizations and governments talking pretty candidly about the way that they interact with content and speech online. And in particular, the ways that there are attempts to censor it for good reasons and bad. But I think regardless of whether the reasoning is a solid one, trying to protect someone against potential, like, say, threats to life and limb, versus just because someone didn't like what was said about them on the internet, regardless of truth. And transparency reports go a long way in shining a light on potential abuses and preventing very slow incremental censorship on the internet.
One thing I would add to that too is in thinking about this question, I think both privacy and transparency together are core to user trust in platforms. I think they go hand in hand in allowing people to understand what it means to participate in a discussion online, especially under a pseudonym. I think people make very brave decisions about sharing information on platforms, including on Twitter, and often share very sensitive information and perspectives and opinions. And so I think transparency and privacy really fit together to build the trust that allows people to share those opinions online. And that's, I think, why they go so closely, fit so closely together.
The first thing I thought about when Michelle was talking about, culturally sensitive topics, I said, oh, well, we could all just talk about the weather. And then I went, oh, wait, no, we can't all just talk about the weather. That's a climate change issue, and it's hugely, hugely controversial. So what can we do culturally? I mean, where do you create that culture of increasing privacy, of increasing free speech online? Is it in the terms of service, or is it, where do you put it?
I think it starts, depending on the type of organization or discussion or form of speech online, frequently it starts with the community that builds it. Other times it starts with just whoever started the company, right? If there's a solid foundation of valuing privacy, valuing free speech, in the founders of organizations, you see that resonate throughout the company as it grows, and they take time to prioritize it. Similarly, within communities, if communities value it and they don't like what you're doing, they'll leave you. And so it's something that you need to think about, not just from an ideological perspective, but a practical one.
So the founder can go out there and be the mouthpiece of this kind of cultural support for privacy and free speech. That's interesting. They can tweet it. Hag, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one other thing that comes to mind for me is the idea of, as organizations grow and scale, the importance of having cultural perspectives that reflect other communities internationally in terms of actual physical location, as well as other types of communities. So I think being mindful and understanding of different perspectives on what constitutes free speech in other jurisdictions, and making sure that that's being incorporated into the overall approach, and not taking just a U.S.-centric approach to things, but really trying to look at things from a global perspective, I think is an area where, as a U.S. company, as we grow and scale, it's an area of focus, and I think it can be a challenge as platforms get adopted globally through the internet.
So it might be different methodologies in different countries, too, of reaching out to people. I'll have to get into that some more. Why did Google start a transparency report? What do you think that the goal of that was?
So I wasn't there when they started it, but I am, I'm very lucky to have been able to get to know a lot of the people that were involved in the founding of it. And one of the very practical reasons was that we had this information. It started with our government requests for user data, as well as government requests to remove content. And this was information that we had that we felt, and I actually am speaking on behalf of Google for a second, that we felt was, it was something that we felt like we could share to help inform a global conversation about the way that policies around the world impact access to information, and with that, users' freedom of speech. And so, we were the we were the first company to really put that stuff out there, and I believe at the time it really just felt like it was the right thing to do. And you spoke about the sort of the passionate leaders and founders who really care about this, and internal stakeholders who really care about this sort of thing. And there is a group of passionate people really pushing this forward, and that's how it began.
Did the Snowden revelations light a fire under transparency reports, do you think?
I mean, certainly not for us specifically. I know that we definitely pushed for more transparency in terms of the very specific U.S. legal process information, but it is possible that other companies were inspired and felt like this was a good time to really sort of heed the call for more transparency as a response to that. But I can't, that's only conjecture. I can't speak on their behalf.
Joe, what do you think?
As an advocate,
perspective, yeah.
As an advocate, transparency reports really provide a window into the integrity of a platform for us. So there is all sorts of dirty laundry that happens between private individuals and governments asking to remove content, and censorship is sort of one of the more pernicious forms of affecting speech, right? It's directly inhibiting or changing things that people say. And so certainly the revelations that there are some very powerful adversaries out there working to block content or otherwise undermine people wanting to, even get access to information. It's not just, right, free speech isn't just about speaking, it's also about being able to receive the contents of what other people say. So for us, it's amazing to see so much activity around being very careful about showing some of the dirty laundry behind how your platform works. And we've seen folks, and Google is a great example of this, expand and sort of push the envelope to where now you're not only reporting on stuff that is central to your platform, but things that interact with your platform. So for example, Google recently started reporting on, excuse me, the number of connections and that they receive that are encrypted, right? How often do you have certain kinds of email transfers that hit their stuff that are encrypted, or other kinds of web connections? And the things that helps us do, for example, is I already knew the journalism, the news sites were having a hard time providing encrypted access to their content. What I didn't know is that the adult industry is also having a similar problem with that stuff. And that can be extremely sensitive kinds of content, extremely intimate levels of interaction. And so now, I don't know if Jess or anyone knows this, but we're actually trying to work with the adult industry to better encrypt their stuff, which can, maybe only folks like us can do that kind of stuff. But I think that's some of the things that I think we can do to help even make, the internet have a higher level of integrity through the insight we get through some of these things like transparency.
Yeah, that's not going to be the test case in front of the Supreme Court, the let's protect pornography case. We won't probably see that one. But good point. It is the Avenue Q, that was a famous Tony Award-winning play, and one of their songs that was "The Internet is for Porn," and I've definitely heard as a right out there in front argument that you'll see changes first in that industry. You'll see new technologies, you'll see new policies, you'll see new support. So not a Supreme Court case, assuming we ever get past the 4-4 holdout situation, but an interesting place to look for where things might be happening next on the internet. The most important thing I want to highlight what Joe just said is I've heard some interesting expansions of the First Amendment rights, and this might be a Supreme Court case. That right to receive information is really interesting. You see people argue around this issue by talking about speech rights and the right to speak and the right to publicly assemble, which are explicitly in the First Amendment to the Constitution in the United States, whereas that right to receive information, not so much. So they usually can't explicitly argue that in court, but you can get around it by talking about the right to free speech. And one of the most interesting things about that right to receive information is kind kind of the expansion of the right to collect information. I mentioned that the next time I'll be speaking in front of a large group will be next month in Las Vegas at the National Association of Broadcasters, which has about 100,000 people. I expect them all to be at my talk, so it'll be a really big room. No, but actually we are having a super session on drones, and they're giving us the ballroom, and I'm going to talk about drone and the First Amendment, and I'm going to talk about, we're going to have a drone demonstration. I'm sure it'll be very exciting. I'll try not to injure myself with that. And a lot of people have been talking about drones and journalists and this new thing that I've only read in a law review article so far, but the right to record, which I think is fantastic. So the idea is that drones would go out there and actually, people using drones and journalists, not really are not talking about the government so far. These are commercial uses of drones, not military uses of drones, just to be really clear on that. But talking about a right to record. So we are at a really exciting time now to be talking about the First Amendment and the expansion of what people think the First Amendment is based on new technologies and the expansion of both the content on the internet and the expansion of new technology for gathering information like drones. First Amendment kind of open for discussion. In the U.S. Outside of the U.S., not so much, right? So we've seen, what are ways that you've seen globally people blocking access to information? That's another big theme of this conference. Have you guys seen that online?
So this is something I directly work on as
Perfect.
sort of a softball in the sense that we have a draft you can search for if you want to on whatever your favorite search engine is. It's called, I think, a survey of worldwide censorship techniques, and it's highly technical. So you may want to only read the introduction, but it essentially catalogs all the technical methods that censors around the world have used to either impede or block access to information. And these can be as simple as just turning the damn internet off, which has happened in Turkey and Egypt in certain cases, and as complicated as pretty sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms that try and detect certain kinds of protocols over other kinds of protocols. And the whole reason we do this is because we want technical engineers to be able to design systems that avoid those kinds of pitfalls so that you make more robust communication systems. So you probably don't want me to get into specific kinds of technical techniques that we've seen used, but if you were interested in that, search for draft hall censorship tech. And if it doesn't make much sense to you, send me an email and we can talk about it, because that's one thing I can do is hopefully make it make more sense to you.
Anything else that you all are doing to address that denial of service denial of service isn't the right word, that's a term of art. It's kind of denial of service. It's a denial of service in some countries or situations.
One of the elements of the transparency report is a traffic disruption graph.
I didn't know that. Wow.
It's a very educational day today for all of us.
I'm glad I got to teach you something finally, Joe. One of the and so what we generally do is when there's it's usually a major disruption to one of the major products and services, or all of them. We have a little annotation. We point to the report in the local country. The Turkish outage is there, so you can sort of look through the historical outages and disruptions and a reason why. And one of the reasons we do that is just generally to make people aware that such a thing happens, but also to kind of remind locally those countries that decide to do things like this that we will record it and that it will be noted historically. And that's something I'm looking into better ways to kind of maintain that and make that a little bit easier, because very practically the sort of updating it and making sure the interface is like really difficult to use. So if you find anything that I don't have on there, like, let me know, and I can put that stuff on there. But that's one thing that I think is pretty cool, actually. And you can also see real-time graphs of traffic as well.
People might know, letting people know that Google might notice if you turn off the internet is a really powerful, and Twitter as well, really powerful educational tool, I would say. It's like turning off cable television during the Super Bowl. People might actually notice if make that kind of political statement, right?
And by all means, people feel free to go to Slido and ask questions.
Yeah, I was just about to remind people that you can ask questions live by raising your hand, and you can use Slido, the tool, and the questions will appear anonymously, I think, right up on the screen, which is fun. We can follow those along. So without getting too technical, Joe, what can we do to protect not just privacy in the abstract, but specifically anonymity online? What are people doing to effectuate that?
Anonymity is hard. And I think one of the key challenges with supporting anonymity is making people understand why it's important. We already have challenges with privacy where people will say, sort of very naively, I have nothing to hide, and I always say, get naked and unlock your phone and give it to me. And then you start to understand that, yeah, there are very serious sort of just social comfort issues with privacy that you sort of take for granted. But anonymity, being able to divorce your identity from the actions that you do is one, important for a number of reasons, to be able to make mistakes, a number of things like that. But it also is this double-edged sword of being an easy way to facilitate crime or other kinds of maybe bad speech, if we can say that. So making the case that anonymity is important is sort of the first thing to do, is to talk about the ways in which it's been important to get us as a society where we are today. The trick is that it's getting increasingly harder to technically support anonymity in the sense that it's
not perfect.
We leave. The way I think about it is, as a physicist, a former physicist, we have hundreds of thousands of years as humans with walking around with the sunlight bouncing off of people, and we sort of understand that how light works. We move behind a barrier, people can't see us, stuff like that. We don't have a similar intuition for moving around online. We don't understand the things we emanate, and increasingly we leave a pretty fat trail of digital exhaust behind us. And
Sure.
I don't think I understand you. I don't think I understand the question. Could you say it one more time?
Could she have a mic? Yeah.
Streaming media.
Thanks for your patience. We're getting the mic.
Okay. What I'm asking about is you were just making some strong statements that anonymity on the internet is easy, or is hard. Sorry, is hard. It's hard to be anonymous on the net. That's your position. And there's been a lot of problems online with women being attacked by hate speech. There's a whole Gamergate. Maybe some of you have heard of that. And that
Can
is
you
large.
briefly summarize what you mean by Gamergate?
It's women who are working in tech fields and on game producing industries. I don't actually know too much about video games, but they are being attacked and viciously attacked online anonymously. So if anonymity is hard, then why is that happening? Like, how can we have this position that anonymity is hard, but obviously it's easy because there's been such vicious attacks on women and women's speech online?
Well, I think just to distinguish the two questions there, I think hate speech can happen with or without anonymity. Some of it anonymously and some of it non-anonymously. So are we talking, for the moment, we're just talking about hate speech from anonymous speakers. Is that what you mean? Okay. Okay, so we're talking about perhaps the lack of consequences when people are allowed to to proliferate hate speech online anonymously.
So I want other people to jump in, but I'll say really briefly, the things I talk about when I say anonymity is important and it's hard are, we work with dissidents in Iran and China that are in regimes where if you advocate for democratic reform, you're going to get thrown in jail or potentially killed, right? And so those folks have to do crazy things to not be thrown in jail or killed. I think what you're getting at in the Gamergate stuff is more related to Sudan. I can't even say it. Pseudonymity. So pseudonyms. That's actually pretty easy, and that's what you see a lot of folks, trolls especially, taking advantage of is, rolling new identities left and right once something gets banned and being able to just say horrific things. Anyway, so I don't know if I have a good answer for you, but someone else might.
Gamers would really like cross-platform to take their identities cross-platform, and I believe that's still in progress. But that would be an interesting. That's what we'll talk about next year with regard to anonymity. Amy.
Just going to say that, I think the question really captures the challenges of pseudonymity online and the ways that it can be abused. And I think, for example, for Twitter as a platform, our general counsel had an op-ed in the Washington Post last year around the challenges between balancing the creation of a platform where people feel safe to express their opinions and creating a platform that is a place for free expression. And so the challenges around making sure that we have protections for pseudonymity so that the dissidents that Joe is working with can find the way to get their message out through the amplification that the Twitter platform can provide, while also tackling the challenges and the abuse that can proliferate through pseudonymity represents really, I think, one of the toughest challenges about pseudonymity and the internet generally. And so I appreciate the question. I'm not sure that gives an answer, but I think it certainly highlights the challenges that companies are facing when they are trying to make a place where where hashtags like why I stayed or yes all women, which are around sharing stories of victims of domestic violence or the experience of physical safety as a woman. I find that the stories that get shared through pseudonymity offer great perspectives that people might not otherwise share, not under a pseudonym. The flip side is that it can be a tool used for abuse, and I think balancing those things is really where the challenge is, and I think your question really hits that square on, so thank you for that.
And I would say with some reassurance, there is a difference between technical anonymity and legal anonymity. So if you're a user and you see someone with a pseudonym or a gamer ID, there are legal processes to find out who that actually is. If their crime has been committed and we need to do a subpoena and find out who that is. That is not, that's not Tor level anonymity, that's just a surface level of anonymity. So that can be broken relatively easily, legal process. Chef.
I was just going to add on to what Amy was talking about, and that it is a exceedingly hard problem, but I don't think that the solution is necessarily getting rid of anonymity, or eliminating anonymity, just because I don't want to get rid of the extreme end of the good that comes with anonymity in order to be able to control the bad. I think it's a larger problem, and it's emblematic of a lot of the prejudice and a lot of the abuse that we see in real life. And yes, it gets a little bit more extreme because there's the somewhat protection of being anonymous or synonymous. But I think that just like in life, we need to be able to say no and say when things are inappropriate and start basically policing when we see something wrong, whether you're a company or just an individual. When you see something, say something. Like, that actually goes pretty far. Just as someone who has worked with a community that can be sometimes a little contentious and get a little go too far in their opinions and passion in the way that they express it, you can always it's amazing to see how quickly a conversation can turn when someone calls someone out, and you start to see slow but systematic change. And I think that's the only way this is actually ever going to be solved.
I love the idea that people get into vicious debates over encyclopedia articles. Love to
Very
be there when that
passionate.
happens. Wouldn't that be fun? Like, serious level of geekdom. Hey, my encyclopedia article is better than yours. Okay, I have just written some entries for an encyclopedia, so that is fantastic. Looking forward to getting yelled at for that. I'm going to answer the easiest question first. Can you get sued for a tweet? Amy will be happy to hear me say, yes, a tweet is a real thing. You know,
You can get sued for anything, right?
yes, but the important part is a tweet is speech, right? It's no different. There is no higher or lower protection for anything you say online than anything you say in real life. It's just speech, and all of the same laws apply. That, in some ways, that makes Amy's job easier, right? Or all the lawyers at Twitter. There's no separate law for Twitter. It's just a regular
That might make
thing.
it easier, but no, we don't have that. Thank you. What Jess said.
Unless Amy disagrees with me, I think that's the way it goes.
I think that captures it.
Good. Okay, so the slightly harder question, which is kind of a topic for an entire panel. Could you comment on right to be forgotten, its global expansion, and finding a balance on transparency and user privacy on that front? Sure, I could comment. Oh, wait, you want more than that, probably. So right to be forgotten, briefly, is started in Spain, has expanded throughout the EU, but the interesting issue, and I just read a draft law review article, this isn't even published yet, someone asking me if should we publish this article, and the article was, should the right to be forgotten be expanded to the US, and what would happen if it was? And you know, in typical law review article fashion, this was discussed over 70 odd pages with 187 footnotes. So yeah, it's not a simple issue. But the big issue is exactly what we're talking about today, and that is the balance between the right to be forgotten and free speech. Right to be forgotten, generally, can you take down information that's on the internet? Let's assume it's true. Let's assume it's not defamatory or otherwise illegal. Can you get that information off the internet, some information about you, presumably, that you don't want on there, just because you ask, right? And that's the right to be forgotten, more or less, as it's being implemented in the EU. And what's the problem with implementing that in the US?
So I actually just want to clarify a little bit. Very specifically, the right to be forgotten as it's currently implemented in the EU applies to search engines, and search engines needing to remove information from search results at the request of an individual. There's no right or, there's nothing in the law about them going to the original publisher of content first. The ruling, the Castella ruling, pertains only to search engines. What kind of search engines is unclear, but it's clear that Google is a search engine in this case. So I think that's a really important point of clarification, because this is not just about free speech or about the right to control information about yourself, but it's also about the right to sort of have a say in access to information. So we're talking about legal factual information that oftentimes is published in a news article, or that is sort of an incidental mention in public record. And the Castella case itself actually was about bankruptcy records that had been reproduced in a Spanish newspaper. And so I think I think it's important to just start with the sort of the basic outline of how it's working in the EU currently. And so in terms of its applicability in the US and the transparency question, I actually would like to hit the transparency question first. The European data protection authorities have been very clear that transparency in this particular instance can pose a threat to the right to be forgotten that they've granted to the individual. So there's a really, really gnarly tension between wanting to be able to share information with webmasters, for example, so that they know that an individual has made a request to have information removed. Can a search engine let the webmaster know? In many respects, you would think that, for example, in the case of online pseudonymous comments, that could actually be a more effective way to have sort of the information removed. If you can go to the webmaster and say, I made this comment years ago, or we can say, this person has complained about this comment that they've made, can you remove it? And then we don't have to block the entire page when you search for that person's name. So there's a really interesting tension there, especially around transparency. And then also in terms of just letting people know in search results that the search results have been modified due to this, requesting of removals. In terms of, I'm not a lawyer, and in terms of its place in the U.S., I think that we've seen what we try to do in the transparency report is actually curate some examples of real requests that we obviously have to heavily sort of anonymize, and then but just so people can get a sense of the color and of the different types of requests we receive. There are some really sympathetic things, and so it's not as as cut and dry as it may seem at sort of first glance. But I think that I like to think that, and this comes back to sort of the right to access information that Jill hinted at earlier. This is not just a question of speech; it's a question of access. And so I think in the U.S., I like to think that the First Amendment would effectively prohibit the extent to which sort of the European ruling has been shaped. I don't know because I'm not a legal scholar. I'm just now speaking as a human being and a U.S. citizen. I really like to think that that is the case. That said, I am sympathetic to the fact that there's some really tough things, especially as more and more of our lives end up online. But I think there are, I think it's rather than looking at one sort of broad solution that removes access at, the sort of the search engine level, can we think of better ways to really deal with what is a real problem that doesn't really limit access to information in the way that this right to be forgotten has been designed to do?
I think philosophically, one thing I appreciate about the United States very much, and I think our electoral process exemplifies this, especially lately, is the concept of the antidote to bad speech is more speech. And I think the tradition of that philosophically in the U.S. Is something that really resonates just at a philosophical level with me. And in terms of when something's wrong or factually wrong, there's also the opportunity to paint the other side of the story and tell your position. And so I think that's a great tradition in terms of it. That is a very U.S.-centric perspective in particular.
So, I mean, I agree with Jess that I think that the right to be forgotten comes from a good place. Europe is not the only one that is considering this as the internet is just becoming all-encompassing of our lives. Everyone here probably has a photo that they're not particularly fond of or something that they've done that they're slightly embarrassed about, regardless of the legality or the embarrassing factor that others think attribute to it. But I think what becomes problematic, in addition to just it being an access issue, is the way that it's currently implemented. It doesn't have a lot of the safeguards that other forms of limitations on speech and access have. There, as just said, not a lot of transparency. There isn't the ability to appeal. There isn't just a lot of, I guess, thought that goes into it in a way that we traditionally think about it. When you look at a defamation case, you have to bring a suit. You have to prove certain things. There are different standards for things of public interest and public figures. There's a lot of considerations that go into it. There's an appeals process if it doesn't work at a district or state court level, and there's the ability to report on it, which granted it sometimes varies depending on the country, but there's at least some degree of reporting, and the decision is ultimately made by a judiciary branch as opposed to Google. Google has been put in a terrible position of they have to make a lot of these decisions based on relatively limited information and representations that are made by these individuals or companies who just don't like something that is possibly true and possibly very noteworthy. I know that we've been, as the Wikimedia Foundation has received a few notices from Google of things that we know are just no longer accessible. And to a certain extent, it doesn't matter that our content hasn't been taken down on our end. What's the point if you can't find it? It's, having access to an entire library worth of stuff and then, well, can you find this one page? No, there's no way without a card catalog. And that's the role that Google's playing for us, so it's important. But I've looked at a lot of these notices, some of them, it's a little bit more obvious than others. You're like, oh, that was probably not something that person wanted out there about themselves. But other times I've read through articles like over and over again, just looking for what could have possibly made this person want to have this taken down. There's just nothing there, and people are not the better for it. And even if our editors, our community of editors, go in and make an article 10 times better than it was as a result of seeing this kind of notice, there's no point in which Google or a DPA would be able to be like, oh no, now it's fine, we should put it back up. It's just gone forever.
Yeah, that's a problem. A couple of things. One, Jess was talking about something that we call the Streisand effects, which I heard at least one person mention yesterday, but at a high level, that's the idea that Barbara Streisand suit did a traditional litigation suit, not a notice of takedown, and by filing something in the U.S. court systems, because we have a relatively open process with regard to public filings, you thereby reduce your level of privacy by filing to protect your privacy. And so I can see the tension that Jess is talking about with transparency reports. So if you do a transparency report about things that you've taken down, that might even reduce the amount of privacy, although maybe increasing the level of free speech and free expression. So that is kind of a catch-22 almost with regard to free speech and privacy.
The other thing I'll add, and looking at the next question about global intermediaries, I think it's relevant. Google understands that it's the right to be forgotten is European law, and that's why Google has complied with it. One of the challenges you now see is France specifically saying that it's not. Google made the decision to delist information within Europe and restrict access within Europe. And France has decided that that's not sufficient in order to protect the rights of individuals in France. And they are demanding global removals. So removing from every Google domain around the world and making sure that you can't find the information when you search for the individual's name. And, I think that raises some really important questions when it comes to this specifically about how, the regulations in one country that doesn't have a First Amendment tradition that we do in the U.S. would ultimately affect access to information or freedom of speech in the U.S. or in Turkey or in Japan or in any other country around the world. And, I think as a sort of on principle, I think that's something that is not a direction that we'd like to go. I know that everybody sort of the phrase "race to the bottom" is kind of a pretty commonly thrown around, but when you really start thinking about the possibilities here, if we sort of see things applying in this way globally, I think it becomes a very different looking internet.
Yeah, so this resonates with me in so many ways. This starts to approach sort of global censorship, and I understand it's for arguably good privacy reasons. As a technical comment, one of the things I worry about here is the internet has what's called latency, which is sort of the amount of time it takes for stuff to get from one place to another, and that is usually measured in milliseconds. Not a lot of time. If you get up to about 500 milliseconds, half a second with phone conversations, it starts to be like a walkie-talkie where you say things like, "Hey, Mom, I'm over. Hey, Joe, over." And it's just like not the kind of internet or interaction you want to have. What I worry about is that global platforms are going to have to sort of, tweak their platforms so much in a regional way that there's going to be sort of an induced, like, oh, geez, now I got to tailor this platform for Turkey, kind of a latency, and that you're just not going to be able to do really cool things that you would have been able to do before. So in addition to sort of the censorship problems, there's these technical things with, it's going to be really hard for startups to be able to develop the same kinds of things that can respond in such a regionally factioned way. And I really hope we can come up with some good solutions to that. But these are really hard questions.
Yeah, we have transitioned to that question. Our intermediaries as intermediaries become increasingly global, how will their policies deal with differing cultural and legal attitudes to privacy, freedom of expression, et cetera, to avoid regionalization? And Joe did address that question. And there was a panel yesterday about intermediary liability, which was interesting as well. There were mostly panelists from blogging platforms, but they did address the issue yesterday as well.
I think one thing from a litigation perspective on that is also that even when a policy is global, you can create litigation strategies that are specific to individual jurisdictions. So for example, as Twitter, we spend a lot of time litigating in Brazil, a lot of our budget on litigating in Brazil on on user notice and educating courts, law enforcement, and trying to move the law along. After Marco Civil passed in 2014, there definitely was a recognition of the importance of transparency in Brazilian internet law. And I think that provided a great opportunity for us as a platform when we do engage in the Brazilian court system to try to move that dialogue along. And in the US, I think the dialogue around user notice is just farther along than what we had seen in Brazil. And so that concept and that principle drives what we do globally. And then the strategy is targeted to a specific jurisdiction. And I think that's one way that kind of philosophies that are global in nature can be tailored to respect individual laws and engage with the litigation and court process at a country-by-country level. So I just wanted to flag that as an example. And
you did mention the other example in the United States, the traditional remedy for bad speech or taken down speech is more speech. We'll call that someone out there will love this. We'll call that the Snapchat theory of speech. You know, there was an FTC prosecution against Snapchat. Everyone assumed Snapchat, there was just a photo and then it would be gone forever. And I think a lot of people think about their expressions on the internet with exactly that same function. You know, they'll say it once and it'll be gone forever. And the interaction with tying it back to Jess's comments about right to be forgotten, is that perhaps the right to be forgotten is truly, it's a nice thought, right? But it's truly ineffectual if you're only doing it regionally and you're not going all the way to the source and squelching the original speech. You're just taking it out of the search engine. So just like Snapchat pictures came back to haunt people, you know, you're never completely eliminating free speech, even in Europe, and especially in the U.S., where people will come back up and raise the same issue or counter issues as a result of the First Amendment rights. So we'll see. I don't think it'll happen, but we'll see if that could actually happen in the U.S. Yes? Yeah, she'll be needing that microphone.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. My name is Jian Hong from UNESCO. We are defending free expression and privacy. One issue missing to discuss here seems to be encryption, because we see encryption as a very important method to protect both. What do you think companies' role? How you have done anything to enhance encryption, or what do you think the challenge would be there? Thank you.
The Wikimedia Foundation over the last year has gone to HTTPS by default, so all Wikimedia sites now are encrypted, and we think that that's an extremely important step in ensuring that people can read and contribute to Wikimedia projects free of fear of reprisal.
I could talk about this forever.
That's why I had to get in right before you, otherwise it's
I
going to be the
won't.
next half
I'm
hour.
trying to think of
Joe's
what's the
day of encryption, right?
I'm trying to think of what's the most useful thing to say. We work a lot on encryption. In fact, many forms of censorship, technical censorship, can be easily thwarted by a well implemented HTTPS, the secure version of the web.
With the little lock, right?
Yeah, if you see the lock, it's good. The trick is that bringing more people up to speed to be able to do that kind of a mechanism is it's not easy. So, for example, a number of companies have gotten together, and a number of nonprofits and civil society groups have gotten together to, for example, create something called Let's Encrypt, and that is a way to dramatically reduce the barriers to being able to put up an encrypted website. So it not only gives you what's called a certificate, which usually is like $20 a year, it gives you that for free. But it also has a set of really cool, geeky, automated tools that allow you to reissue those things, and you never even see it. So a lot of what we're doing on encryption is to make sure it's easy to use for people who implement it, but also make sure that folks like lay users who don't need to know about Diffie-Hellman key exchanges and these crazy cryptography concepts, that they just can see that something's working, and they can see when it's broken, when encryption has been thwarted, and know maybe you shouldn't use the platform for certain kinds of sensitive speech. One of the things, and that's the last thing I'll say, sorry, with encryption, we focus so much on confidentiality. You hear people talk about, privacy as being the thing that's the most important part of encryption, but actually, increasingly, integrity is the most important property that encryption provides. And what I mean by that is confidentiality means that the communication between something and you is private in some manner. Integrity means that you know that the stuff that was sent from there to you hasn't been changed in transit. And that's important because you can imagine, you're going to Wikipedia or something, and someone inserts different content or something on the fly by undermining the connection. It's not encrypted. But more importantly, we've seen things like China did some really weird stuff recently where apparently there's this app that allowed people to jump the line to buy train tickets around a certain holiday. China actually, for about 2% of visitors to Baidu, injected a little bit of code, a little bit of what's called JavaScript, then attacked GitHub, where this app was hosted, this sort of software platform, and took the whole site down for 3 days, which if you're a nerd and you write software, it's like 3 days off of work for a while because this main platform you used to write software was gone. And it was strange that they used this really powerful tool to take down what is essentially a ticket buying app. And so that's a case where instead of changing the content of the communication, they're changing some of the software involved in displaying the communication to include attack code to attack something else. So that I'll shut up.
On the Google side of things, Joe gave a really great pitch for the HTTPS transparency report earlier, and that not only reports on encrypted connections to websites, but also Google's own products and services and progress toward HTTPS across. It's not all of the products, but it's many of the major ones. And then similarly, we have a safer email transparency report that talks about encrypted email connections. So I think those are two things on the transparency side on our end. Did
you remember the stat that was recently released about the email that over 40 days there was some 44% increase in?
Yeah, I have it written down somewhere, but I have not committed it to memory. But
yeah,
yeah, there was when we launched that report last year, there was a pretty significant increase in adoption of sort of these safer email technological methods. So that was great. And then on the sort of the advocacy front, through Google Take Action, I late last year started doing some stuff to kind of just build awareness about what encryption actually does practically for like a normal person. So, trying to come down from the debate about the dark web and all of these other things to say like, well, actually, when that passcode you enter in your phone, like that has something to do with security. All of these things are, related, and it's not just encryption to protect criminals, but encryption is sort of, again, to reference Joe, like, it's about integrity. It's about making sure that the thing you think you're connected to is the thing you are in fact connected to. And so trying to distill what is can be a very technical discussion into, like share graphics and animated GIFs that people can like use to understand and then spread the word. And so that we're creating sort of a counter dialogue to just the one track of encryption is bad.
Right, and what we're talking about at a high level when we're talking about things like encryption and supportive technologies is increasing trust. I would say there's a pretty high level of trust about what people see on the internet. To begin with, I had a vigorous debate with some of my college and law school age staffers last week about citing Wikipedia as a source. It's real as far as they're concerned. This is as real as anything out there. So there's a high level of trust. Michelle will be happy to hear. But
just make sure you click the Cite This Article link and it will tell you how to do it. Right.
Yeah, we had a discussion about the difference between primary and secondary sources and even tertiary sources. You don't want to talk about that. But one of the questions that is up next, and we actually have in our pre-prepared questions because we discussed this in advance, and talking about the counter technique, the de-identification The question is, how soon will there be widely available, i.e. available to average users, not just the FBI, integrated tools like speech, pattern recognition, IP tracking to unmask authors? In this room yesterday, they talked about Fitbit and their ability to use that to identify people and their behaviors. I have heard that Fitbit can identify individuals by their gait, by their walking patterns. So there's all sorts of interesting frontiers in de-identification and finding out via individual technologies or individual feeds of information, or getting into the whole big data thing, cross-database collection of information, and basically to de-identify people, thereby significantly undermining that trust that we were just talking about. What are you folks doing to address, to both create and to address these issues of these new de-identification tools?
For us, one of our, I guess, underlying principles and approaches towards privacy is collect as little data as possible. And I understand that that's not something that all will be a great technique for all companies, but there are things that you can still do in terms of what kind of data you collect, the form that you keep it in, and for how long you keep it. I think increasingly it's going to be harder and harder to de-identify someone successfully to the point that there's no possibility of re-identification. But there are things that you can do in order to ensure that it's at least harder. I think that's a challenge that will be constantly evolving as more tools, as Jill was talking about, are out there, but you need to be increasingly careful about things that you put in your public data sets. Make sure that you're talking about high-level trends when you are discussing data that you collect. I'm sure Joe has some opinions about this as well.
This question is a little strange in the sense that it seems to be talking about user-available tools for unmasking people. I'm not sure what to say about that. One thing I can talk about is that
Get a new hobby.
I don't know. It's if the questioner's in the room, feel free to clarify the question. Something I can talk about is, I know many companies design certain systems so that they don't have information that they don't need. And a great example of that, and I'm sorry I'm talking so much about Google, is Google's research arm developed something called Rapport, R-A-P-P-O-R, and if you're a developer in the room, you can use this now. And essentially borrows a technique from the 60s when it was really hard to ask people about sensitive questions like, are you a communist? You started getting really weird variations in answers because people were not sure that the survey, the person giving the survey could keep that stuff secret. And so what they would do is they'd say, so now they ask you a survey question, are you a communist? And then they'd make you flip a coin. And if the coin came up heads, you would answer yes, even if no matter what the right answer was. If it came up tails, you would say the right answer. So if you had 100 people, taking this survey and the coin flip is fair, 50 of those yeses, are forced yeses via the coin flip. Anyway, this is getting belabored, but the point being that you can make it to where individual sort of records about people, you can't tell if any given answer is, the result of a coin flip or the true answer. But if you aggregate them, if you add them all up, you can very easily pull out of that the noise and actually get really good aggregate results. And that's an example of a technique that researchers are developing, and this is sort of cutting edge stuff that you can embed in apps right now that will allow you to collect information about people, but none of that information is perfectly, you can't tell if any of that information is true at the individual level, but allows you to have really nice aggregate statistics. Anyway.
Survey design increasing anonymity is one of the tools. Yes.
I was just going to add kind of more of an old school answer to this from the litigation front, which is, in addition to the technological questions around identification, there are still civil subpoenas that we get all the time as a company trying to unmask pseudonymous and anonymous speakers on the platform. And I think that the importance of considering the First Amendment and not just providing notice to users, but instead actually looking at the nature of the request. And even if the user doesn't step in to file a motion to quash, to make sure that the types of requests as platforms we're getting are mindful of the First Amendment and that courts have considered the First Amendment implications of unmasking before that happens is still a really important part of the process, in addition to the the technological questions that are also a very important part of the process. So I think there's great precedent in the U.S. on that, and so we're still trying to move that forward as well as on the technological side.
Good. Well, we're getting close to the end. Maybe one last question, which I have 47, and but I want to open it up to the audience. Any last questions? We usually conclude these kind of discussions with talking about the future and legislation. What can the government do? What would privacy, if we had overwhelming privacy legislation, what would you want it to look like? You know, when we have sectoral privacy legislation in the U.S., we've got HIPAA for healthcare, and we've got finance regulation. What would overall privacy legislation look like?
So CDT for many years has been calling for baseline privacy legislation. The U.S. is the only, I think there's one other one, I can't remember right now, that doesn't have comprehensive privacy legislation that sort of says it's not about health data, it's not about finance data, it's about personal data of some type. And unfortunately what you see right now are there are gaps in these things. So you see health apps that have very poor security because they have no liability based on the sensitivity of the information they're generating. We have some thoughts about that. They're very hard to summarize, so I won't do that. But if you search CDT baseline consumer privacy legislation, you can read a lot about that.
They're working on it.
It's never going to happen.
Well, you never know.
think
Could be here next year.
definitely a consistent and slow approach would, I think, be the wiser way to do this. One thing, I don't know how many of you have had to deal with data breach notification laws, but they're different in every state and territory, and it's a nightmare. So having a national approach, I think, will help. And you're starting to see state by state, states are trying to address this gap, and it's going to lead to a similarly piecemeal approach. And that's a little bit horrifying when you think that that's going to be our entire approach to privacy as a nation. But the reason why I say I'd like to see it done slowly is because I think every bad piece of legislation that goes through is extremely hard to correct later. And what you're seeing more and more of, not just in the US, but everywhere that has addressed a lot of the privacy concerns that its citizens have expressed as something that needs to be fixed, is that the people who are making these laws don't really understand the technology that they're legislating. And I think taking a slow approach that allows them to consult and become experts in this before having long-lasting impact on the way that the global approach to privacy is formed would be prudent.
Yeah, I agree with Michelle. If we get any baseline legislation, it's going to be on data breach that has the most visibility. Thank you so much, panelists. That was fantastic. We'll be around and be glad to talk to you later. Thank you.
Just a mirror of what I see. Oh, baby. But at your best, you are love. You're a positive, motivating force within my life.